here once again. So, like I said, this was where we left off last class, and we're looking at this chart here, which sort of shows the peak of the National Rail Network. So, from 1916 forward, we're going to see a couple of trends that are different from before, right? Our national rail network size is going to slowly decline. It's going to decline slowly over a course of a number of decades and then sort of precipitously in the later half of the 20th century. And it's hard to see, but there's also another line on this chart, which is a series of dots. This is the number of what are called Class 1, right, which is Class 1 railroads, which is a way of determining size. So these are the largest classification of railroads that exist. These are railroad corporations or companies. We're going to pick this up right around the time of the peak, where we have over 180 different Class 1 railroads, major railroads, and we're going to also watch sort of a series of consolidations and mergers take place to today, where we have 6 now, right? So we're going to go from 185 to about 6 over the course of 100 years, and that's going to be sort of, both of those kind of stories are going to be the undercurrent of the different events that unfold during this time. All right. So, the first big event we're going to talk about is World War I. And World War I was a major significance to the national rail network in the United States and the railroad industry as a whole. When World War I began, as we just saw in that previous graph, we had over 185 different rail companies, and the war effort, sort of a mobilization on scale that the country's never seen before, required these rail companies to coordinate freight shipments on a scale that also had never happened before. So pretty quickly, the logistics system of the rail industry just started to fail the war effort. In 1917, the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, president, passed a law that actually nationalized the railroads. And this was pretty controversial at the time. They established an administrative arm of the United States government called the United States Railroad Administration. There was no Department of Transportation yet. This was sort of its own thing. And its mission was to control and coordinate and finance all rail operations in the United States. And as you can tell, this was a huge job. When we have, a 250,000-mile rail network in the United States, all of a sudden, we're going to make a government administration do that. So it went about as well as you might imagine. However, it didn't achieve the goals of the war. There were a significant amount of savings when it comes to coordinating transportation, right? When you do a troop train from, San Diego to New York, you don't have to hand it off between 10 different railroads, right? It can be administered as one troop train from one side of the country to the other, and all of the sort of economies that go with that. That was what the War Department was after at the time. So this was one of those sort of acts of necessity that seemed like a good idea at the time. However, it led to a bunch of different problems. So during the course of World War I, we have, propaganda here, right? Here's one of, actually, this is called propaganda, call it, supporting the war, right? But it says every bad order locomotive is a Prussian soldier, every live locomotive is an American soldier. Let us get on top of the Prussian locomotives and make American soldiers out of them. So that's all right, I'll follow up, I guess. But this is also the time, where we first see sort of like this image of Uncle Sam. Sort of this was, motivational advertisement for the war. And then sort of here we are, right? We have World War I soldiers being shipped out various different places. So this was the goal, and this was very much the effort at the time. But it did lead to some issues. And just as it would today, right? Nationalizing a large industry like this was very controversial. In 1920, after the end of the war, this nationalization continued. And the reason it continued was primarily because nobody really knew how to unwind it. So there continued to be private railroads that existed on paper, but their assets were under the control of the government. All right, so the question of what are those assets? Who do they now belong to, right? And then what value do they have? And then what value did they have before the war, right? And then is there a difference that the government needs to make up to those private companies? Yes.
Just as an aside, one of the things that did, and it happened again in World War II, there was such a need for rail cars to get troops and equipment to the coast that it became a real growth of the trucking industry. So where trains are making short deliveries, all of a sudden if you're going to go a certain distance, you need to use a truck, which is good for my own industry.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of changes, but this was before a time of like a national highway system or even many state highway systems. So this was still very, very challenging to do. So the question of valuation, right? Like what damage did nationalization do to these corporate interests, and was there an amount to be paid back? Was a major question there. So in 1920, Congress passed the Esich-Cummins Act for the reprivatization of the railroads, which extended a previous act called the Valuation Act from 1918. And the goal of these acts, firstly, the Valuation Act was to attempt to answer the question of what are these assets worth after the war, what are they worth before the war, and does the government sort of have any makeup to do for the damage done to the assets themselves. And then the actual Reprivatization Act was to try to come up with a plan to hand these assets back over to private companies. And this was an amazingly huge job. In fact, the actual value is the valuation of these railroads actually began during World War I itself. And the USRA at one time, federal workers are in the news lately because we have too many federal workers. During World War I, the USRA employed 300,000 people just to value the railroads. They were surveyors, they were enumerators, they were accountants, right? And this was just to do this one job during World War I. So at one time, the USRA was the second largest administration of the United States government. So, food for thought as to where we were and where we are now. So here we are. The work that was done during this time, though, was sort of a one and done kind of thing. And the surveys, accounting, lists, and all the other data that was produced from this, it only happened once. It is some of the most useful historical reference now material for all of us, because all of that stuff lives on and it provides a great snapshot into this time period, what the railroads were and what they covered. Some places we have rail corridors where the only survey ever done was done during this time. So World War I, big changes there, where we went briefly about a decade worth of actual national rail administration. All right, so we're going to move on here to abandonment. So what is abandonment? So now, as we saw in that chart, we're going to start to see a decrease in our actual rail network, and that is through a process called abandonment. I think previous class we talked about the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Interstate Commerce Act, which was from 1887. The federal government wants to now regulate commerce between the states, and the major thrust of the Interstate Commerce Commission was to regulate railroads, right? So the Interstate Commerce Commission holds jurisdiction over where rail service operates, and the goal of it is to make sure that if it's fair and acceptable and expected that a railroad can operate service profitably, that it does that without gouging customers or shippers. And on the flip side of that, if it's not possible to offer that service, that railroad be allowed to then terminate that service. So that process of terminating a service, for our purposes here today, that is what we're going to call abandonment. So there is a large process. There is a very detailed process for abandonment. It involves a railroad making a filing to the Interstate Commerce Commission. There's usually a hearing, right? A local hearing where, different stakeholders come out and say, hey, if I lose train service, this is going to, wreck my business, whatever, et cetera. And then the railroad sort of makes their case, and then the Interstate Commerce Commission rules whether it's fair or not, right? Not the best way, but really maybe it's the least worst way, right? But we've yet to come up with a better system than this. So here's an example of a notice. This is not from around here, it's from Pennsylvania, but this is an example of what you might expect, right? Notice to public, passenger train service between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre will be abandoned. Effective January 1st, 1953, right? So this would go out, this was less than a month before, so that's pretty soon, right? But it does say that they've already applied to the federal and appropriate state commissions for approval, and it's already been granted. So this would have been a final notice, hey, passenger trains are going to stop. You'd also see this for freight as well, right? If freight trains were going to stop to a certain station or location, there would be a notice on there that says, hey, after this date, no more freight trains. So I have some pictures here just to illustrate what does abandonment mean. Abandonment doesn't necessarily mean the trains have stopped, right? Sometimes the trains can stop without there being a full abandonment. Other times, trains continue to run after abandonment. So I think I probably just gave it away, right? But can anyone guess whether this light rail picture here, is that a picture of an abandoned railroad or?
Yes, it is, because that's where I used to live.
Correct. So we have the Baltimore Light Rail running on the old Baltimore Annapolis, right? Even though there is transit service operating on there, that line is actually abandoned, and it's abandoned for freight and interstate passenger service. That's different from transit. So sometimes we can see active rail corridors still that's technically abandoned. And then on the flip side of that, we have this picture down here, which is over on the Eastern Shore here. We have a line which has trees growing in it, right? This is a line that is technically not abandoned, right? It's clearly inactive and has no train on it. But if there was a justification to run rail service on it again, that could be offered without any additional regulatory steps, right? That is still, I'm not going to call it active, but that is still a functioning railroad, at least in a regulatory mindset. So that is, I believe, from one of the state-owned lines.
Would the line that used to run from Turlock to Vienna be considered abandoned, defunct, or what? How's that?
I can come back to that.
Okay.
That one breaks the system a little bit. So maybe we can come back to that one if you remind me on a couple more slides. All right, so that is a crash course on abandonment. So now that we know a little bit about abandonment, we can talk about the Baltimore and Eastern, and we'll talk briefly about the Great Depression. Picking back up on our timeline here, we can see there's going to be a series of consolidations that begin to occur. We did talk about the Baltimore, Chesapeake and Atlantic, and the Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. Those are shown in gray on the chart. And their sort of creation and sort of heyday. But now we're getting sort of to the end of the 1920s. We're sort of seeing, there was a slide on the creation of the Maryland State Highway System, which is happening during this time, and a decrease in both steamship operations, a decrease in freight revenue, a decrease in passenger traffic for, want of driving your car on the state highway system now. And so the Maryland, Delaware, Virginia goes into receivership first. And shortly thereafter, the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic creates a subsidiary company called the Baltimore and Eastern. This purpose of this company is to assume what profitable operations can be had from the former Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. Pretty quickly, the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic itself also goes into receivership, and it is actually folded into its subsidiary company as well, the Baltimore and Eastern. The Baltimore and Eastern is owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the purpose of this is to sort of reorganize both railroads and try to squeeze out some sort of utility from these existing lines. So if you remember, these are both east-west lines, Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic, and the Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And they're very vulnerable to steamship traffic and sort of cyclical traffic of people going to Ocean City during the summertime, but not in the wintertime, and various other things. They're also not really competitive. for exporting goods, right? You have to put your stuff on a car, it has to go to the steamship, and then it has to get put on the steamship and then taken wherever it has to go, probably put back on a train again. The railroads that these lines are competing against, right? You just put your stuff right on a car and it goes off into the national rail network, never to be seen again. So it's very difficult to compete against that. So the Baltimore and Eastern is the first sort of effort that we start to see like significant rationalization. So on the chart here, we start to see our rows. Many of them start to terminate, right? For example, row 25, 26, 29, 31, 32, 35, and 36. And we're going to talk about a couple of those. Interesting fact, the Baltimore and Eastern would continue as a corporate entity until 1982. All right, let's talk about one of these. The Vienna Swing Bridge. So on the record here, this is the first Interstate Commerce Commission approved rail abandonment on the Eastern Shore. ICC docket 8885. It's actually available in the National Archives. You can go pull it up and read it. It's very interesting. I've done that before. It's got all the minutes from all the hearings and everything. And if you remember back to our what was supposed to have been the sort of beginning slide for today's lecture, but unfortunately I had to split this up a little bit differently. There was a quote on there from the Army Corps of Engineers, and I'll read it again here, right? So that slide said, notice a complaint has been made by the navigation interests that the Baltimore and Eastern Railroad Bridge over the Nanticoke River is an unreasonable obstruction to navigation. The matter will be considered at a public hearing to be held by the undersigned at Higgins Auditorium in Vienna, Maryland, August 6, 1930 at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Signed, Warren Hannum, Lieutenant Colonel, Corps of Engineers, War Department, United States Engineer Office. So this is a very interesting example, and like I said, this is the first example of a piece, a segment of railroad that is sort of on the chopping block. On our map, I have Vienna labeled there. I don't have this segment labeled because it's very small, but it's right there between segments 28 and 29. So, long story short, the quote navigation interests, right, are the barge companies that are operating barges up and down the Nanticoke River. The Nanticoke River is a navigable river. The port of Seaford in Delaware is actually a major Chesapeake Bay port, even though it's in Delaware. And at the time, this is a picture of the swing bridge in Vienna with the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic train sitting on it. There's a very narrow channel here. This bridge would swing open, and you'd have to get your barge in through there. I believe it was 20 feet or something pretty small. Enough to get a steamship through, not really enough to get a like sort of bay faring barge through. So now, the steamship companies and the barge companies go to the Army Corps of Engineers and say, hey, this bridge is in the way. We want to run bigger barges. We want to run bigger ships. This rinky-dink little bridge is in the way. And begin this hearing process. There's another story going on possibly in the background, right, which is the Baltimore and Eastern had been running passenger trains through these communities, Salisbury, Hebron, Mardella, Vienna, Hurlock, right? And, you know, these communities really rely on these passenger trains. They really love these passenger trains. It would be very hard for the railroad to say, hey guys, no more passenger trains, right? There would be a public blowback. It is possible that the Baltimore and Eastern and the quote navigation interests were sort of conspiring to remove this bridge because it would suit both of them, right? Neither the railroad nor the navigation interests really wanted to deal with this bridge anymore. So we don't know for certain, we never will, but it is very possible because those incentives do line up. Long story short, the abandonment of this bridge is approved in 1931. This bridge is then removed, and the former Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic, right, is now severed. It's no longer a connection that runs all the way from the Chesapeake Bay to the ocean. Once that happens, There are no more trains that run the entire way. There are no more sort of need for many of these other segments. And so in quick succession, we see, by the way, this is segment number 29. That's closest to this that I put on the map here is segment 29. Pretty quick succession, we see segment 25 and 26 also go. I'll put an asterisk that segment number 25 did partially hang around and remain. But the part where it actually served the wharf at Love Point, that was let go and abandoned pretty soon. As was the bridge over the Choptank River down here by the Dover Bridge. If you ever drive down over the Dover Bridge and look to the south, believe it or not, there used to be a railroad line that went out into the marsh, over the Choptank River, and carried on its way over to Preston. It's hard to see now, but there used to be a bridge very similar to this one actually that used to be there. But once the line was no longer contiguous, there were a lot of other pieces that were like, yeah, we don't really need that anymore, right? And so it begins. There's a process now that's underway of chopping up and rationalizing the network because it's no longer working in a way that it was built to work for, right? The economic conditions have changed. So quick side note. In 1930, don't remember the year, the Ocean City Inlet was created by a storm in 1933. 33? Okay. Shortly thereafter, right, staying on the topic of the Army Corps of Engineers, the Army Corps undertakes a project to stabilize the inlet. It was decided, very briefly, they considered closing the inlet back up again. It was decided, for whatever reason, to keep it open. And so, therefore, the Army Corps undertakes a project to stabilize the inlet. And I don't know why this picture came through so badly. I had this in higher resolution. But here are some photos of the breakwater being built. These are Army Corps of Engineers photos. So what we're seeing is this, the lower part of Ocean City here. The rail bridge used to enter the south part of Ocean City here. There was a train station where the bus depot is now. This bridge was all made useless by the storm. So this was all not in service any longer at the time of this photo. However, the rail service to West Ocean City was still there, and it was used to actually construct the breakwater that exists today on Assateague Island. So to do this, they erected a trestle bridge. You can see part of it in this picture here that ran all the way out over the bay, over to Assateague and across. And the purpose of this was to erect a stone breakwater throughout this entire area. Here's a picture of the stone breakwater. And this went on for a number of years before it was complete. I thought that would be interesting just to include that because it's hard to picture what that would have looked like today. But when we talk about what was the railroad up to, right? Like even in the Depression, you see the typical things, people, freight, right? Fruit, vegetables, whatever, coal, fuels, we talked about those. But there's also like one-off weird things that the railroad is up to, like moving a mountain's worth of granite blocks down to Ocean City, Wouldn't have been able to happen without it. All right, we're going to skip ahead a couple of slides here. We're going to pass over World War II. Sorry, we're going to pass over World War II. Hot take because we don't have a lot of time today. There's other things I want to talk about. World War II is very well documented. We can maybe revisit that in a future thing. But we're going to skip ahead to the 50s and 60s, where some of the patterns of rationalization and abandonment are carrying on in force, right? After World War II, they sort of kick into even higher gear. So in the 1950s and 1960s, we're going to start to see some pretty major failing infrastructure. There hasn't been significant capital improvements made on these lines since the 20s and 30s in some places, and earlier than that in other places. And so just the physical rails, the roadbed, the ties, these are all things that are starting to fall apart. Some places worse than others, but generally a little bit is going on everywhere. We have rising costs for labor and sort of a struggle to adopt technology in a lot of places for want of capital. So we still have track gangs, like the picture up there, where we have, 10, 11, 12 guys with shovels and picks and rods. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was still some of the common practice over here on the Delmarva Peninsula for some of these rail corridors. And even when you're paying these folks minimum wage, it's very expensive, right, to have to maintain an entire rail corridor in this way. There were machines developed in the 40s that would automate the track, alignment and stabilization processes. There were machines that will, pack the ballast into the track and align the rails and insert ties and all of that, even spike down spikes and everything. But those machines were very expensive and they could only be spent, bought and used on rail corridors that were making a lot of money. So they did not typically get used too much down here. You already mentioned trucks. So truck traffic, we now have a state highway system where we have roads that are still 2-lane roads, but they're wide. In Maryland, we've established like 100-foot wide corridors for our state roads, which are nice and spacious. They're great for trucks. They're pretty direct, and all of a sudden, when I have a carload of vegetables or whatever that I've grown, and I used to drive to the train station and put it on a train to go to Philadelphia, I can now just put it on the truck and just send it to Philadelphia, right? And that's easier for me, the farmer. It's easier for me, the freight broker. And that pattern, as it takes hold, really hurts the freight revenues of the different branch lines that exist. Almost all of that vegetable, agricultural, finished product sort of freight evaporates and leaves the railroad during this time. So what do the railroads do to try to combat these losses of revenues? They try to implement cost controls. This is the era of the end of steam engines. So steam engines go away. They adopt diesel electric locomotives like we see here, right? These diesel engines can be operated by fewer employees. They cost less to operate. The fuel is less expensive and more widely available. And they can pull longer trains less frequently. Meanwhile, during this entire time, we have sort of a corporate culture of the Pennsylvania Railroad now, which, as we've said, before, still controls the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, the PB&W, and the Baltimore and Eastern. And by this time, it also controls the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk, right? So we're consolidated under one sort of umbrella. During this time, the Pennsylvania Railroad carries on with its culture of always paying a dividend, right? So its stockholders would always be rewarded with a return on their investment every year of something, between 3 and 5%, right? And this pattern would continue. They were very proud of this throughout the 1910s, 1920s, their heyday, and then even into the 50s and 60s when money started to get very tight. They would still pay a dividend, although it did start to shrink, right? The dividend started to shrink. It was a matter of pride that they still paid one, however, right? Other Pennsylvania Railroad lines did make a lot of money, right? Lines, the main line through Pennsylvania that went out to Chicago, right? Very busy line, made a lot of money. But a lot of our lines here on the Delmarva Peninsula spent more money than they made. That's not a good recipe if you're trying to run a business. We have more bad news. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So throughout the course, I've been trying to sort of talk about this dynamic of sort of northern Philadelphia and Pennsylvania economic influence versus sort of western Baltimore economic influence and how they sort of cross paths on the Eastern Shore. And Baltimore and the state of Maryland sort of attempts to build a railroad first in the 1830s, but fails. They sort of attempt to use steamships and various east-west railroads to try to capitalize on the Delmarva Peninsula in the first part of the 20th century, and that sort of peters out as well. Right, by 1954, 52, we get the third, I call it the third time is the charm for the Western Shore, because now we have a vehicular highway that is constructed across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge that is going to forever tie the Delmarva Peninsula to the state of Maryland, or at least a good chunk of it. And here's some pictures from this. I like this picture because it shows, and I had several slides on the actual ferry operation that existed here prior to the Bay Bridge because I thought that was interesting, but we're not going to be able to get into it. This is a photo taken from the ferry that existed between Kent Island and Sandy Point State Park prior to and during the construction of the bridge. So here's folks that have probably done this several times, right? They travel across the bay, and then you see this sort of ominous looking structure start to come up in the middle of the bay that's taller and bigger than anything anybody's ever seen. Like, you know, we're used to it today. It doesn't look too much like impressive now, but back then it must have been something really weird to see. But, you know, suffice to say, this bridge is constructed. At first, we all know, right? It's 2 lanes, but that's all you need to establish a continuous vehicular freight operation across the bay.
Your bottom photo shows where the ferry came in.
It does, in the back. The slip is right next to it.
You can still see some of that when you come eastbound.
Yep. And here's our, you know, here's our newspaper article for that day, Bay Bridge opening.
The article underneath there says there's no danger of flying saucers to the Capitol.
Yes, look online about that. There's a whole sort of subtext to the whole flying saucer thing that I had no idea, but when I did the research for this slide, that came up, and I was like, what is the deal with the flying saucer? But it's an interesting, these newspapers are great because you see all the other things happening, right? And sort of at that time, there was sort of this, you know, weird pandemonium about flying saucers. You know, there were some lights that appeared. It's very reminiscent of recent, like old lights, you know, must be flying saucers.
Like the NATO thing.
So the more things change, the more they don't change and they just stay the same. So there's a whole, you know, the history of the Bay Bridge is awesome. It's really interesting, and maybe, you know, there's more to be said about it, but I don't want it all too long here because we got to make our way across.
Sounds like it could be a course.
It might.
Find somebody.
It might be. So in the face of all this, I brought our chart back here now, right? So we've gone up to about 1950. We see the pattern is unfolding here, right? Like so we see a number of abandonments that slowly start to take hold, a number of sort of a little bit of retrenchment that's happening. You know, over here on Delmarva, there's not a whole lot more consolidation that can happen. Other than on paper, everything is sort of operated under the Pennsylvania Railroad already. But nationally, we do see railroads trying to consolidate to control costs much in the same way they were trying to adopt other technologies. But it's still not enough, okay? And by 1968, 1970, here are some charts that were published showing especially East Coast railroads, United States railroads that were suffering from the effects of automobile and vehicular freight truck traffic, suffering in terms of return on net investment, right? The red line shows Eastern railroads versus national railroads. Net income is falling, net working capital is very low, and employment is, they would probably argue, not falling fast enough, but still lower than normal. So these charts sort of show the picture is getting very dire. Merger talk has been around since the 20s, and we've seen it unfold, right? Actually, Delmarva was really ahead of the game as far as mergers and consolidations. We're already achieved that by the 1950s. But the Interstate Commerce Commission remains very suspicious of mergers. They see this as sort of corporate power grabs, right? Like we've seen major, large, powerful railroad companies exploit people in the Gilded Age, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. We don't want to see that happen again. We want to see sort of democratically organized railroads that serve the public interest, right? And to do that, we need to keep them smaller and less consolidated. That was sort of the vision of the ICC. For better or for worse, and then that's going to sort of run into some problems here in the future. talked about the charts already. The number of railroads still sort of remains high, although it is starting to fall, and that's sort of reflected by the hesitance of the ICC. Oh, yeah, that's great. The ICC era is actually shown in blue. So we will talk about the end of the ICC here in another slide or two. Hysteria. So there's one last step on the mergers and consolidations front that can take place here in the in the eastern United States. So now at this point, the Delmarva Railroad story sort of becomes more of a national story for a little while, and we sort of are tied to events that go on at a national level as opposed to sort of a local level. And it's sort of especially a sort of eastern region of the United States sort of story. And at this point in time, the biggest event that goes on in our region here is the creation of the Penn Central Railroad. In 1964, and actually prior to that, the Pennsylvania Railroad had been looking for partners to merge with. Pennsylvania Railroad, right, those of the constantly pay a dividend sect, there was a knowledge that their revenues and their forecasted revenues and their expenses and their forecasted expenses were not starting to look very good. And over the course of the next decade or two, they did realize eventually that the company was going to go bankrupt. So they tried to do a number of things to head that off. But what they sort of were most dedicated to was trying to continue the pattern of merger and consolidation that had worked very well for the previous 100 years, right? If there's a pattern at all to sort of be gleaned from this chart, is that we've started out with many, many different local railroads. We've gone to a couple of sort of larger groupings. We're now getting close to the end of the red section here, and we're going to see Penn Central, which is labeled here 1968. At this time, like, we're going to have one solid color that crosses through all of the different rail pieces on the Eastern Shore. So it's very much the extension of that pattern. And the belief is more consolidation and more merger meant more cost control, right? And that would solve all the problems. We could just continue to sort of rationalize our way to a functioning company. Also very much, sounds very, very modern in a way. So the New York Central System, I don't have a slide for the New York Central System, but is of a similar size to the Pennsylvania Railroad, operates from New York City out through New York State, out into the Midwest United States, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and places south as far as Kentucky. Very large system, had its own financial struggles. The Pennsylvania Railroad, slightly larger, extends over Delmarva, Pennsylvania, and then many of the same states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Both of these railroads are, like I said, struggling financially, but the thought was, hey, if we consolidate them together, right, they can sort out their redundancies and then sort of turn a profit again, right? We can solve all these problems. At least that was the vision. So in 1968, after a lot of skepticism from the Interstate Commerce Commission, their merger was approved. And it was announced, this is a picture of the announcement of the merger between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central System to create Penn Central. And this is Al Perlman, this is the CEO of the New York Central System, and this is Stuart Saunders, who was the CEO of the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time. And they were essentially sworn enemies because their railroads were very competitive with each other. And here they are putting on their best faces for the newspaper, saying how great it will be and how you should buy Penn Central stock. Buy it today. It will be great. This was the nation's largest merger at the time, certainly the largest railroad merger. And it created a system which controlled over 20,000 miles of track. It had over 94,000 employees at the time, which today's entire rail industry, or at least Class 1 rail industry, has about 120,000 employees. This one railroad in 1968 was almost the size of the entire industry today, at least by employees. Revenue in 1968 was $1.7 billion. In today's money, that's $15.4 billion. Expenses at that time was that entire sum, right? They were essentially not turning a profit. However, that wouldn't come out until later. On paper, the first year of Penn Central, 1968 and 1969, they showed a loss of $2.8 million, right? So actually pretty small. They kind of said, oh, that's just, expenses for merger, right? This is like things we have to spend to integrate our railroads together are driving up our expenses just temporarily. Don't worry about it. No big deal. So the Penn Central merger, it's critical to understand this. There's a number of great books written on the subject. The Wreck of the Penn Central, I suggest this one by Dowling and Binzen. There's a more recent book by Rush Loving, The Men Who Love Trains. This covers the Penn Central and also Conrail and then later years as well. It focuses on a larger timeline. Both of those books are very good to understand where we're headed here. But there's going to be, I titled this, Events Are Set in Motion, because once this merger begins, it sort of sets into motion a series of events that really aren't going to be controllable to some degree by many parties here. And so we're going to see some events run their course. However, we're going to talk about Penn Central some more. So Penn Central was early to the party when it came to conglomerates and diversification. So in addition to their corporate identity of running railroads, it was also very trendy at the time to diversify their business interests, right? Railroads are very capital-intensive businesses that don't generate a lot of revenue on that capital. So the idea was, hey, we can make a more valuable company if we get into some of these other businesses. And typically you might say, okay, well, maybe a railroad might get into like some ports and maybe even pipelines and things, because those are transportation related, so that might make sense. The Penn Central Railroad really got into some crazy stuff in the 1960s and 1970s. Not all of it was sort of unexpected. Railroads had owned hotels before. That wasn't really strange. Railroads we've talked before are inherently real estate companies, so owning real estate's not necessarily that strange. But they sort of pushed these ideas to their maximum. And the Penn Central started investing in huge amounts of real estate, especially in places that you wouldn't expect, like in Arizona. And in Arizona, they founded a company called Six Flags, which we're maybe still familiar with. Six Flags over Arizona was not just a theme park, but it was a large amount of property speculation. So the Six Flags amusement park, part of it was sort of a front for land speculation in the Phoenix area. So at one time, like a good chunk of Phoenix was owned by Penn Central. Sort of crazy to think about, but as we know in these Sun Belt states, right, like real estate is very, at least nowadays, it's very cyclical, right? So it's very boom and bust. Other things they got into were pipelines. So this is Buckeye Pipeline. And actually that was a good investment. That was not a mess up. That is still around today, Buckeye, and it is still a profitable company. So, okay, they get one point for that. This is the era where we see the railroads looking at their existing real estate properties and trying to maximize those profits. One of the areas that is most famous is Madison Square Garden in New York City. Madison Square Garden sits where Penn Station used to be. It was demolished in 1968, and Madison Square Garden now sits in its place. And you can say, well, how can a railroad demolish its own train station and build an arena? Well, they own the New York Knicks as well. So they needed a place to see them play. They also own the New York Rangers, the hockey team. Why not? You know, railroads, they can do whatever they want. There was also significant insurance businesses that were acquired at this time, because insurance is always a moneymaker, right? And the last one I haven't talked about here was Executive Jet Airlines. So I think this is Frank Sinatra, actually. Executive Jet Airlines was the beginning of sort of a private jet industry. You know, if you're like High Fidelity, you can like rent yourself an executive jet and you can get zipped across the country. And this was potentially a big moneymaker. However, it was rife with corruption. There are books written just about executive jet, and it's like, you know, pretty controversial and interesting on its own right. Scandalous, we'll say. So if you want to look at that, that's a pretty interesting story in itself. There were laws at the time that said railroads could not own airlines. So they sort of used a series of shell companies to own executive jet, right? And suffice to say, it became almost pure corruption. And executive jet was responsible for vaporizing many, many millions of dollars of Penn Central money that already didn't exist. So all in all, a number of very bad diversification, with the exception of the one, which is Buckeye Pipeline. Which I will say, Buckeye Pipeline makes its money at the expense of moving things by train, right? So still maybe not the greatest. Not a whole lot of fun things going on here. However, the key to these is that for a number of years, these different companies and their complexities allow the accountants at Penn Central to show profits and revenues in a way that is just so complicated that nobody really calls them on it. And for the period from 1968 to 1972, even though they're losing money very badly, they can actually show profits to Wall Street during that time. And yes, that's all illegal, and it all comes out here very quickly. So bankruptcy. In 1972, the shell game, which is essentially what it was, comes to an end for Penn Central. They had to continue to borrow more and more money to cover their expenditures. Originally, they had lines of credit, conventional lines of credit, which they exhausted. They then went to secondary lines of credit and even sort of daily payday loan type lines of credit, which they exhausted those as well. Eventually, people started getting suspicious. The financiers and the bankers, they go, why are you trying to borrow all this money, right? They get suspicious. And they wind up declaring bankruptcy. So what is bankruptcy? Bankruptcy is established by law, and it's supposed to be an orderly process that can be used to unwind a company. It's supposed to protect bondholders first. So if you own bonds in this company, you're supposed to get paid first. You're supposed to be able to liquidate the value of the company and use that money to pay bondholders first, shareholders second, and then any other loan holders third. So this works typically like if you have a tire shop or a grocery store or whatever, right? You can declare bankruptcy and it's pretty orderly and simple, right? A judge will come in, they'll say, okay, you're declared bankruptcy, I'm going to assign a trustee to you. This trustee is usually a lawyer. They're going to look at your accounting and they're going to start to dole out the different things and try to make everybody whole. How do you do that with a railroad that has 20,000 miles of track and 94,000 employees? And that also is critical for the economy of the entire Eastern United States. Well, how do you value that? How much does this Penn Central, how much is it even worth? Right? We talked about valuation in terms of World War I there a little bit ago, how hard that was. Well, to figure out a value for something, you have to have somebody that wants to buy it. So after the bankruptcy of Penn Central in 1972, the call goes out to other railroads in the United States. Hey, are you interested in buying? What are you interested in buying? Do you want to buy this? What if you buy that? And the situation was so dire that almost no railroads were interested. It was like, no, we just want to put a wall up. They literally talked in terms of walling off the United States into East and West and saying, no, we're not even just going to run trains in the Eastern United States anymore. It's no good, not even worth it. And that makes it very hard to come up with a value, right? You have to have a value so that you can start to try to make these folks whole. So where does that leave? The process, right? There's a bankruptcy judge, there's a series of trustees that are trying to unwind this company. They turn to the government. They say, all right, federal government, we're days and weeks away from shutting down rail service, sort of involuntarily, right, unless something happens. There was an attempt to go to the Department of Defense, because the Department of Defense has a sort of emergency fund for transportation problems that still exists today. Got several $100 million in it. The Department of Defense was on the verge of trying to fund help for the Penn Central, but that fell through at the last minute. And so this sort of was put to Congress to try to figure out. And of course, Congress is highly reliable solving complex problems. They have an excellent track record. And so most railroads feared, they were sort of caught between two minds, right? So one mind was like, no, screw Penn Central, we don't want anything to do with it. But they did sort of realize, well, if we don't do something, we're probably going to see the federal government renationalize, right? They did not like World War I's nationalization program. They did not want to have it happen again. So they said, well, maybe we need to intervene here and do at least something to come up with a plan. I already talked about these books here. And so we're going to talk now about what was the plan and what was the government's reaction to these things. I already talked about Rush Levin's book, so I'm going to skip over that. So here's our last segment here for today. We have 30 minutes to go. All right. Intervention, 1973 present. And we have a quote. States have questioned the advisability of disposing of all railroad rights of way immediately. Many fear that future industrial development or errors in the final system plan may require future rail service where it now appears unnecessary. The Department of the Interior, some states, and the Illinois Central Gulf Railroad, among others, have suggested a form of rail banking, land banking, to solve this problem. This is a quote from the final system plan of the United States Railway Association. I have a copy of it right here. One of the volumes of it, multiple volume, if you want to pass it around and look at it. But that we are going to talk about next. But before we do, we're going to talk about the Passenger Rail Service Act of 1970. So 1968 to 1972, Penn Central is in sort of its dying throes, right? The first thing Congress tries to do, at the strong urging of the national rail interests, is relieve the freight railroads of their obligation to run passenger trains. Under the Interstate Commerce Act, right, all train service is the same. The federal government requires freight service where it requires it requires passenger service. These are both considered public goods, right? However, passenger rail service, in the face of airline traffic, in the face of automobile and bus, right, is becoming extremely unprofitable and money losing. So the first step that Congress does nationally, this is across the entire country, not just in the Eastern United States, passed the Passenger Rail Service Act of 1970. This creates Amtrak. This is the birth date of Amtrak right here. And as we see, this is a metro liner on the northeast corridor here. This was very good from the perspective of the railroads. The railroads were able to hand over all interstate passenger trains to the National Rail Passenger Corporation, also known as Amtrak. Amtrak then, from that point forward, is responsible for offering those services.
So who was Amtrak?
Amtrak, still is a company that is structured much in the same way as a regular rail company, but it's entirely owned by the United States government. So they're shareholders to the degree, there's only one share, it's owned by the government. And the President of the United States appoints the board members of Amtrak, and the board members appoint the CEO, just like a regular company. And they serve terms.
Regulated by.
It is. It is a class one railroad, just like all the other ones, and it's regulated by the ICC's descendant, which is the Surface Transportation Board, which we'll talk about in a second. So it operates and it runs just like any other railroad. They anticipate turning a profit this year. We will see. They anticipated turning a profit in 2020. Of course, COVID happened, but we will see how that works. But the National Rail Passenger Service Act, huge change in the way passenger trains are offered in this country. Overnight, half the interstate passenger trains in the country go away. Right. Amtrak begins April 1st, 1972. This covers inner-city passenger only, the commuter trains, what we now know as MARC or SEPTA or New Jersey Transit, those continue to be run by Penn Central at great loss. All right, so that's a problem. What's going on in Maryland as well? In 1972, we have Hurricane Agnes. Hurricane Agnes comes through in October of that year, knocks out a number of railroads across the state. Here are pictures from the western part of the state, where we have in Carroll County, major destruction of rail lines that were formerly active. We have bridges that are washed out. This is now the Walkersville Southern Railroad Bridge over the Monocacy River in Frederick County. And so even at a local level, right, like to add insult to injury, there are a lot of problems that start to come forward here. I was able to grab the newspaper article for this as well. I'm sorry, this was June 1972. I don't know why I said October.
Transit at the Patapsco River in Oakland. Susquehanna.
All right, not a good time for railroading in the late 60s, early 70s. Now we'll talk about the Department of Transportation, Federal Department of Transportation. I wasn't able to grab a lot for this slide, so we'll just note that it was created in 1966 by legislation. It was begun in 1967. It's the federal entity that houses all of the various administrations to do with transportation, such as Federal Highway. The Federal Railroad Administration was created at this time. It did not exist before that. And these are executive administrative bodies. They're not independent agencies like the ICC. The Department of Transportation they serve at the discretion of the administration, right? So they are executive in function. They carry out the government's agenda, basically. The ICC exists still at this time, but it is not part of the DOT, right? It is separated and it has its own structure. And as an independent agency, it's trying to exist slightly separate from the rest of the administration itself. This was to try to preserve fairness, right? So, try to be sort of understandable over the course of time. Now that we know a little bit more about the context of what's going on, despite the 1970 Passenger Rail Act, this benefited many Western railroads, and they were sort of fine at that point. But the Eastern railroads, especially Penn Central, were still struggling. Penn Central was still in bankruptcy, despite some help that was provided to it in the form of bailouts. In 1972, with Hurricane Agnes, 3 other Eastern railroads that existed also declared bankruptcy. So it's now not just Penn Central, it is almost all Eastern railroads. I think it's but one in New York, the Delaware and Hudson, was not in bankruptcy at this point. So things are getting worse instead of better, right? And in 1973, Penn Congress finally sort of gets a hold of this problem, and they pass the Regional Rail Reorganization Act, the 3R Act of 1973, but it was actually passed in 1974. But it's the 3R Act of 1973. And Congress knows that it is not good at solving problems. So we have to at least give them credit for that, or at least they knew it here at the time. And they knew that they were not going to be able to just pass a law that says, here's the solution. So what this law did was establish the USRA again, not the United States Railway Administration, but it now recreates an agency called the USRA, but this is now the United States Railway Association, right? This is going to be a separate committee that's established by Congress, and it's going to be given some powers from the Interstate Commerce Commission, the power to abandon, the power to dictate where trains run and where they don't, and the power to combine railroads together. This is given to the USRA from the ICC during this time, and they're also charged with coming up with a plan for the reorganization of regional railroads in the eastern United States. So the Department of Transportation doesn't like this because they feel like that's their job. The Interstate Commerce Commission doesn't like this because they feel like that's their job. But the USRA is created. It is got several very smart people part of it, luckily. And despite sort of infighting between the three agencies, by 1974, or the publication of the final system plan, they have actually come up with a scheme to at least try to rehabilitate the way the railroad system works. So it's not quite nationalization, right? We've stopped just short of nationalizing the railroad again because that sort of didn't work either. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to thread the needle between creating a private entity that's going to solve this problem without putting it entirely on the lap of the government. So here's the final system plan. Here's a map from the final system plan. And they actually looked at a couple different options. They're like, okay, well, we had two railroads before. Maybe what we can do is we can just try to rebuild the two railroads, right? And then they can compete with each other. They attempted to do something like this. Their economists looked at this and said, that's probably not going to work. We might not be able to get that to work right. What they were very afraid of was just complete collapse. They were very afraid that if this didn't work, they would have to fully nationalize. And so the plan that they settled on ultimately was consolidating everything into one railroad. We're going to put it all into one basket. We're going to cut off all of the extra bits that don't make any money. And we're going to try to give this one railroad its best chance of being profitable again. And we're going to try to spin it off back into the private sector, right? And so this was very controversial.
What's the date of that plan?
Where is let me see that right there. This was published 1975. And so you'll notice this is one of the preliminary maps or lines that are going to be included in this new railroad, which I won't name yet. Right? If we look at Delmarva, there ain't nothing. That's it. It's going to be the end. Unless something happens here. So what's on the chopping block? Here are some pictures that some of you may recognize. Here's a picture from Queenstown, Maryland, taken in 1978 of Friel's Lumber before the construction of Route 301 next to it here. There were actually, these buildings are still there on the south side of the highway. And this is what's on the chopping block, right? So at the time, there was rail service to Friel's Lumber. But as you can tell, right, things are falling apart. And the final system plan is very interesting. It goes through customer by customer. And it shows, hey, they were shipping this many cars. They were making this much money, right? we're talking $600 or $800 a month in revenue from here to maintain all of this track, right? Things have sort of really gone off the rails, so to speak. We also have, this is in my now hometown of Denton, right? So this is now Chop Tank Supply. If you ever go there, great hardware store. It was formerly known as Denton Supply, and it was rail served.
Was the rail, like where the Crystal Road is, or was it behind it?
Which one's Crystal Road?
That's what Chop Tank Supply is on.
It's behind it.
So,
Yes, it's behind Chop Tank Supply.
okay, that makes sense.
Closer to
Alright,
town,
yep.
yep.
Is 301, Route 301 in that picture?
It would be on, the power lines are still there. Route 301 is on the other side of the power line, so it may be a two-laner in this picture, but you can't quite see it. It would later be dualized. I'll share a link as well. I have all of these pictures on my Flickr page. If you'd like to go through and look in more detail, you can pull them up on there. What else do I have here? All right, what gets left out? Basically all of Delmarva, right? Almost all of the businesses object to this. Sorry about Friel's Lumber and Denton Supply, but you guys don't matter to Congress, sorry. However, there are a couple businesses that do, and Frank Perdue is one of them. Frank Perdue intervenes. I had a slide on this, but we had to cut it out. Frank Perdue intervenes because he says, hey, I have a feed mill in Salisbury, and I really need rail service to that feed mill. So hey, guess what? We're good again. We have track now. We're part of this. In 1976, Congress passes the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act. That's a mouthful. It's known as the 4R Act. Congress is not created. The 4R Act says, okay, there was a final system plan and we're pulling the trigger on it. This is going to be the way it is. Number one. Also, we're going to release the railroads of having to provide commuter rail service to the states, right? We're going to set up a system for that. And we're also going to set up a system for states to intervene if necessary, if they need to keep some of the stuff that we're cutting off, right? So it does a lot. Most importantly, it creates Conrail, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, which is good hat. I brought a lantern as well. I brought an Amtrak lantern for the back table. I brought a Conrail lantern, and then I needed another nice looking one, so I bought a green one. That's not from either of those, but those are what sort of modern rail lanterns look like. Last week we had old school lanterns. These are what they look like kind of today. So here we have the Conrail network, and you can see how complicated it is. It is created from all of these old railroads, and much like the Rail Passenger Act cut 50% of passenger trains, Conrail cuts like 50% of the rail mileage. So overnight almost, during the course of just a couple of years, we see huge changes. Conrail, all right, so up at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, we have a great example. We're going to see this if you come on the trip on Friday. I'm going to skip over it. All right, so Conrail starts in 1976, and it has a big job. It has to integrate all of these railroads together. This is not something to shake a stick at. Congress provides many hundreds of millions of dollars to get this process going. And they start burning through that money, and they make some progress. But the economists and the business guys at Conrail pretty quickly realized that the final system plan is not, they didn't get it 100% right. There was stuff in there that they kind of needed to keep. There was stuff not in there that they kind of needed to get rid of, right? So when the USRA gave its powers back to the Interstate Commerce Commission, Conrail then has to go back to the Interstate Commerce Commission and fight the same fight it had before, which was, hey, I want to abandon this. I want to get rid of that. And this was very challenging. So it is unclear between 1976 and 1980 whether Conrail will fulfill its mission to become profitable again and become private. So in 1980, For this reason and a number of others, Congress passes the Staggers Act, and that's a picture of our late Jimmy Carter there, remembered as a sort of liberal president who also presided over deregulation of mostly every industry in the United States. So our history is a complicated thing. But Jimmy Carter signs the Staggers Rail Act, deregulates the rail industry, right? One of the things it does is that it streamlines the ability for railroads to abandon and cease running trains places. No longer do you have to go and prove to the ICC. Now your threshold is you go and tell them I'm stopping trains. And there has to be a case against you to stop. The burden of proof shifts. This also makes short line railroads very easy to start, very easy to create, and very easy to operate, right? So if a rail industry is getting rid of rail corridors, now you can kind of, just as it was starting any other business, you can now start a short line railroad and maybe run that little piece yourself. So we see what we call short line railroads, which are a couple miles here, a couple miles there. These begin to crop up all over the place. It also takes away the power of the ICC to dictate what the rates are for freight. Average rail rates measured by inflation-adjusted revenue per ton mile are 43% lower today than they are in 1981. So from Staggers Act to today, rates per ton mile, right, adjusted for all the sort of time and everything, they're actually lower now than they were before, right? So that shows pretty significantly that some deregulation may work here in the context of history and also with an asterisk, right? What else we got here? All right, Harry Hughes. Does anybody remember Harry Hughes? Of course. I don't remember Harry Hughes.
Before you were born.
Harry Hughes was from Denton. He served in the Maryland legislature from 1955 to 1959. He served in the Maryland Senate from 1959 to 1970. Great. He did a lot of great stuff, including basically inventing the way that Maryland does its budgets, which is frequently forgotten. But all the stuff that they do in Annapolis nowadays, basically Harry Hughes engineered all of that. So basically forget that, but he deserves credit. Most importantly for us, Maryland creates a Maryland Department of Transportation. He is the first secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation from 1971 to 1977 under Governor Mandel at the time, who was remembered for being very honest and very straight shooting, never hid anything in his life, wound up resigning in disgrace because of multiple scandals and whatnot.
It did get a steroid.
Also a real honest guy there. Harry Hughes started the Maryland Department of Transportation, right? And he set the tone for the way Maryland wanted its transportation system. Before this time, Maryland had like a dozen different transportation agencies. We had a port, we had a highway commission, we had all kinds of things that didn't talk to each other. The goal of Harry Hughes was to knit them all together into something that was coherent. The work continues, but he did a lot of work to try to set that up. He would later become the governor of Maryland, 57th governor from 1978 to 1987. And he recognized one of the things he's remembered for was he wanted a balanced railroad system or a balanced transportation system, right? That meant like rail operations, airport, port, right? It all had to work together. So some of the things he did under his tenure were the Baltimore Metro system, beginnings of BWI Airport, and we're going to talk today about what he did with the rail infrastructure as well. So I brought this book too. This is his biography. It's available on Amazon if you're interested in reading it. I learned a lot from this actually. So maybe there's some interesting stuff that's from behind the scenes in there. So yeah, this could be its whole thing. Harry Hughes, interesting fellow. Wish I had the opportunity to meet him, but unfortunately I have not. All right, what happens here with Harry Hughes? So while he is DOT secretary, he is watching the rail industry sort of melt down, right? He's watching Congress try to intervene. He's watching all these things happen. And when he becomes governor, he is in a place where he can actually, make significant decisions. So one of the things under Harry Hughes' governorship is Maryland utilizes some of its rights under the 3R Act and actually purchases many of the rail corridors that are not included in the Conrail system, right? In 1982, Maryland pays the former Penn Central Company for these corridors. From 1976 to 1982, Maryland had been subsidizing their continued operation, so many of the trains never stopped running completely, but Maryland was sort of subsidizing them, right? So like the customer would pay a couple $100 and then Maryland would also pay a couple $100, right? And these costs sort of continued to climb very fast. So something had to be done that was a little bit more than just continuing to shell money out. Maryland issues bonds for $9.8 million. And here's a couple of photos from the actual closing of the deal. And there's the check, $9.8 million check. I haven't figured out who this is yet, but I'm trying. This is the representative from MDOT. This is the representative from the Penn Central Corporation, because he is very happy that he's getting his $9.8 million. Sayonara. Maryland DOT had already set up a state railroad administration within the government to handle these properties as well as administer the MARC train service, which, if we remember, had to be taken over from Conrail, right? The commuter rail on the other side of the bay, right? That had to be handled somewhere within the state government. That's all created during this time. And here we are, the Maryland and Delaware Railroad. The Maryland and Delaware Railroad was actually created in 1978, prior to the Staggers Rail Act. And it had operated under that subsidy structure from 1978 to 1982, at which point the state of Maryland bought the rail line itself and helped the Maryland and Delaware fund its operation for continued rail service over much of the lines that we purchased. So on the timeline here, you can see where the roads start to turn purple. That signifies Maryland DOT ownership. So you can see many of the lines, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way down to 13, as well as a number of others. And Maryland is not unique here, right? Delaware follows almost the same pattern. Pennsylvania follows a similar, they get to a similar place at the end of the day, but they follow a little bit more local structure to this. And then Virginia also pulls the same trigger, right? They wind up purchasing the line all the way down to Cape Charles. Sort of talk about, at the time it seemed like a good investment. MDOT actually goes so far as to help fund the continued operation of the car float at Cape Charles. Right, so for a time, Maryland owned one of the car floats. That didn't pan out real well. But the state does what it can to try to continue rail operation to where it can happen. Right, but things were very hard. This is what things look like. Here's a picture of the Federalsburg train station in 1978 with the tracks that are decaying. Here's a picture of from Kent County in 1978, where you see almost no railroad ties are left. Many of these rails are at this point 90 years old, right? And now they're still there, and now they're like 120 years old. Many lines are immediately unusable. The state sets up a capital program to try to reinvest in many of these, has some great successes. The initial economic assumptions that the state of Maryland makes about sort of profitability and the balance sheet with these things sort of fall apart within about 2 years. And the initial plan to repay the bonds with revenues from rail operations also does not come to pass. The State Transportation Trust Fund winds up paying those bonds back. So be it. things are going fairly okay until 1986. 1986, there was a savings and loan crisis that famously sort of blew back on Harry Hughes. And the state of Maryland started to have a very significant budget constriction, much like we are today. Oh, we skipped ahead quite a few slides. But we're going to take a break here from, 1986, Harry Hughes gives way to Governor Schaefer. Governor Schaefer, who's also a supporter of rail, carries on the program, as well as a couple of other things in Baltimore, notably the light rail and a bunch of other interesting projects. From Governor Schaefer, we go to Governor Glendenning. Governor Glendenning presides over like a huge budget surplus. Many very large capital improvements are made during Governor Glendenning's tenure. Glendenning then goes to, I'm on the spot, Ehrlich. Ehrlich is next. Ehrlich looks at the rail infrastructure that the state owns and wants to get rid of it. So he tries to put a plan together to liquidate most of it. But the same problem that existed for Penn Central exists for Governor Ehrlich. And it's not worth anything if nobody wants to buy it, and nobody wants to buy it. So they ultimately abandon their plans to sort of liquidate the assets. Governor Ehrlich then yields to Governor O'Malley. Not a whole lot changes under O'Malley. There's a couple other capital projects that happen. Then we have Hogan for 8 years. Not a whole lot really notable changes under Hogan. And then we have Governor Moore today. Meanwhile, Conrail. What's Conrail doing during this time? Conrail starts to thrive again, or actually for the first time in the mid-1980s, so it does succeed. Spoiler alert. Several privatization attempts early on are unsuccessful. So I'll stop there. There were a number of attempts by the Reagan administration to privatize Conrail. Right? Conrail really didn't like that. They had like little slogans like "Let Conrail be Conrail," right? Because the reason why there was genuine pushback to privatizing Conrail. Conrail became for a time the most successful shipper-oriented railroad in the United States, right? So in a period of a decade, the shippers go from "I hate railroads, get me out" to "Boy, Conrail's actually really good," right? And so it was during that sort of time where the government started thinking about, okay, how do we get out of this, right? Up until this point, the federal government, much like Amtrak, is the shareholder of Conrail. In 1999, CSX and Norfolk Southern strike a deal to split up and purchase Conrail. I'm going to jump right to the end, right? 1999, we see the end of Conrail. So in terms of the Delmarva Peninsula, we see Norfolk Southern buying the assets over here on Delmarva. It becomes the Delmarva District. The line on Delmarva remains a secondary. So it's not a primary line like a main line. It is a secondary sort of branch. Mostly because it has only one end, right? Like it dead ends. If it were through to somewhere, with a car float, but maybe not even, right? It would maybe be more of a main line. This was an investment justifiable for Norfolk Southern largely because of the Indian River power plant, right? There's a big power plant over on the Delaware side that had a lot of coal that was shipped to it. But largely these post-Conrail, right, even to some degree, Conrail, definitely Norfolk Southern struggled with sort of the local freight needs of the Delmarva Peninsula, right? So there's still tons of agricultural freight, stuff that's not final product like watermelons and tomatoes and stuff, but grain, corn, soybeans. These are very bulky, heavy, not real time sensitive commodities that if you're ever out on the roads, right, we see trucks all the time, right? We got grain and corn stuff that's going literally in every direction, right? The railroads sort of let all of that freight go, right? Like too difficult, not profitable enough, not worth our time, right? So all of that sort of wound its way out to the highways. And in 1996, we see the end of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Congress passes a law called the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. Very creative. It ends the Interstate Commerce Commission, which has sort of been defanged by the Staggers Act anyway, and it creates what we now have, which is the Surface Transportation Board. The Surface Transportation Board does many of the same things, right? But it is also an independent federal agency. So here we are, short line. Norfolk Southern says, Delmarva's not worth my time in 2014. They don't get out completely, but the pattern of short lining or leveraging sort of smaller business units to do the sort of secondary sort of rail work carries on and becomes a very strong pattern. In 2014, Norfolk Southern hires the Delmarva Central Railroad to come and operate its lines on Delmarva. This is all made possible by the Staggers Rail Act, right? They would not have been able to do that particular job if the Staggers Act did not deregulate the rail industry. So we now have a short line in the form of Delmarva Central that operates the main stem of the corridor. I don't have it shown. So this chart sort of shows ownership, not operation, right? But many of the purple lines, or at least some of the purple lines, are still operated by the Maryland and Delaware Railroad. All of the other lines are operated by the Delmarva Central Railroad. That's where we are today.
I think they just took over the line from Seaford to Cambridge too.
Not yet.
Hadn't been signed yet. But they're after, it was in the, something was on Facebook yesterday.
Yep. So a couple months ago, the Delmarva Central filed with the Surface Transportation Board to acquire the Maryland and Delaware Railroad. And so what that will do when it's done is we will be back to where we were again, right? Like where we have one railroad that handles all of the operations within the peninsula. But what about our quote here at the beginning, right? Where it talked about states worried about the advisability of abandoning all of its rail corridors, right? Like, should there be a system of rail banking? And we do. We have a system of rail banking. There's another congressional act, right? Boy, I'm gonna make Congress sound good here. Called the National Trail System Act, created a process for rail banking. And what this does is, it is a regulatory procedure which allows rail corridors to be preserved for future rail use while allowing them to be used for other things in the interim period. It is first suggested, as we saw in the quote, by the Rock Island Railroad in the 1960s. The Rock Island Railroad said, look, we can't make money on most of our rail network right now, but we don't really want to get rid of it. Is there a way we could not pay taxes on it? And maybe you can just sit there, because possibly in the future, we might want to run a passenger train or a freight train or something on it, but, the future is a crystal ball. We can't read what it says, but rail companies need relief, right, from paying for things that they don't use. And that became what we know as rail banking. So it was adopted, actually, by the Final System Plan in the 1970s. The first rail banking was called fossil fuel rail banking, which was intended to preserve lines to coal mines and power plants, right? Later on, it became sort of broadened out to include interim uses like trails, even roadways, and actually other utilities and power lines.
And fiber optic is really big.
Correct.
On the Western Shore.
Yep.
They love all the rail lines.
Yep. So this has become a practical tool to conserve rail corridors for the development of bike trails while also preserving a critical transportation need. And so we have a number of rail corridors on the Eastern Shore that are now rail banked. The former Maryland and Delaware Railroad, like Maryland and Delaware 1, from Clayton to Easton is now rail banked. It was rail banked in 2013. Partially it's been converted to a trail. Partially it has not. However, it is all available to be converted to a trail when the time comes. Right? It is there. It is still existing as a railroad. It's not abandoned. What rail banking does is it comes in right at that last step of abandonment and says, hold on, before completing the abandonment process, we're going to just pause and we're going to let other uses occur on it before that happens. So it is possible, not likely, but possible, that that line can be reactivated in the future for whatever rail purpose needs to happen, right? The Surface Transportation Board, more specifically, they only see things in black and white. They see that line as a railroad still. Yes?
So is that, the maglev train, the holdup on that is because there is no corridor available because it's in use? And they're
Yeah.
trying to expand it, aren't they? But they've kind of been on pause for years now.
Maglev is tricky because it needs a ton of property, and nobody's proposed a plan for maglev that actually shows a pathway to acquiring all that property. Right? The maglev folks want the federal government to condemn and control the property on their behalf. Nobody's willing to do that. So in the meantime, they're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And so here we are, in our, today, we've made it. We did 100 years in 90 minutes. And so many of the lines that we have here still on the Eastern Shore have been, unfortunately, many have been abandoned. We have some that are rail banked, we have some that are active. And I'm going to send out an email later, but I have, like I said, a Flickr account, which has a bunch of photos that you can check out. There's also a map that we have from MDOT that you can look at as well that helps to show some of these things, although I think this map does a pretty good job. And from the state level, you know, the state still tries. We still have a number of rail corridors on the Eastern Shore. Many of them are active, and we're trying to continue that. Many of them are rail banked or on their way to being rail banked, and we're trying to also leverage that where we can as well in order to conserve those corridors for the future. It's nice. Rail banking is a great tool, you know, in lieu of continuing to run trains. So either way, there's a big future there.
Go back to that line from Porlock to Vienna, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, where is that?
So that line in the final system plan, that line exists in here. It was not included in the plan for Conrail, right?
Right.
So under law, anything that was not included in the plan for Conrail was okayed to be abandoned, right? It was like sort of authorized for abandonment. All of the state-owned lines were also in that bucket. The state opted not to purchase that corridor, right? So the state buying things, like sort of prevented the abandonment from happening, right? So the corridor itself from Hurlock to Vienna is owned by Delmarva Power. They bought it. It became abandoned, but not sort of by typical fashion. It became abandoned through the 3R Act. So there's not a series of documentation. There's no hearings. There's no docket. There's no Interstate Commerce Commission records. It stopped being a railroad corridor sort of by way of a pre-authorization from the 3R Act. So it still exists as property that's owned by DP&M, but it's not actually regulated as a corridor. So on the other side of town, like from Hurlock to Preston,
Yeah.
that's owned by the state of Maryland. And we're, hopefully that will be rail banked here.
Well, at one time, it was probably 15 or 20 years ago, a friend of mine wanted, he thought, had an idea about having a tourist run from there to Vienna, you know, purchasing a real small diesel, but, you know, that wouldn't work. I mean, there's too much rehabilitation needed on it.
It's very expensive. Yes, it's very expensive. We struggle on Delmarva with capital because things are very wet over here, and railroad ties are made out of wood. And so when you put a railroad tie in the ground, it stays wet for most of its life. And so most of the railroad ties that get installed do not last as long over here as they would in other places. If you go over even into the mountains, right, where there's stone and there's very good drainage, railroad ties last about twice as long. If you go out west, where there's just not any rain ever, right, railroad ties last for 50 years, right? But over here, we get about 10 years out of a railroad tie. And railroad ties are like $150 a piece right now. And so it gets very expensive.
You put, concrete railroad ties.
Yes.
Railroad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, concrete has come a long way. Amtrak likes concrete very much. Concrete is good for some applications, but when the cars get very, very, very heavy, concrete fails faster sometimes. So it's tricky. There's a couple of caveats with concrete. That's why Amtrak likes it, because their trains are not very heavy. It lasts very long. On a freight application, concrete gets a little more complicated. Not impossible, but complicated. There is also now recycled plastic composite ties, which are very exciting. Class 1 railroads are starting to use these because wood is getting more expensive. We're not, there's not unlimited amounts of forests that we can cut down for railroad ties, but we got plastic bottles everywhere, right? So if we can make plastic into railroad ties, that would be very helpful. That's one possibility. They're still also very expensive. So it's hard to justify sometimes increased in this day and age where we have tight budgets. Can we spend twice as much for a railroad tie to get a plastic one? Maybe, if we can be sure that it lasts twice as long or longer, possibly. That would require a very coherent, thoughtful planning operation, which politically is sometimes challenging. So, but there are a lot of upsides here. Here's a picture of Ridgely. So our rail infrastructure is still very important, right? Even if it's not operating, right? Ridgely benefits from its rail trail, right? Many other towns and counties benefit from their rail trails. Many other places like Erlock benefit from its active railroad. And in the state as a whole, there are lots of towns that have rail corridors that would love to have trains, right, but can't because they have a CSX or a Norfolk Southern, that they have to deal with. But certainly when we're talking about taking trucks off the road and improving freight traffic, right, shipping things by rail is the future again. And the Delmarva Central has actually done a great job with this. In 2018, they reintroduced a program to shuttle grain and corn across the peninsula now. So now there is freight service that can just take, grain and corn from one side of the peninsula to the other, as opposed to putting it on trucks. And that has done a lot of help taking many, many hundreds of trucks off the roads. There's more progress to be made in that. So very, very exciting stuff.
So the areas, like from Charlotte to Vienna and also down in Hallwood to Cape Charles, just where they have taken up, well, the railroad,
Some of the roads.
that could never go back to a railroad,
Correct.
but the rails to trails
Frequently can.
could,
Yes.
just okay.
Correct.
Here, did Federalsburg go back to, well, there has always been.
Federalsburg has rail service, yes.
When did that go back? They built the,
82.
was it 82?
Yeah.
Okay, they,
I like to put in a
Roundhouse.
plug for the Fredericksburg Museum. We have an exhibit in there on the Maryland and Delaware Railroad. We have a model of the train station. And we're opening back up on March 21st. We're open on Fridays and
a
Saturdays.
lot of info.
And if you might come see a good exhibit, we've got a little bit of history on the Maryland and Delaware anyway. Through Railroad through Fredericksburg from its start. So.
There are a bunch of different places as well. Also, Suggersville's got a great spot. We have even the Ken Island, right? Ken Island Historical Society. Is that right? Yes. Yeah. They're very active with rail. Queen Anne's Railroad Historical Society too does a lot of great stuff. So there's a number of local spots on the Eastern Shore. Down in Virginia, there's another couple.
Parksley's, yeah.
Parksley is, yes, yep. So very good stuff. It doesn't take a lot, very far. You
I
can
just
get,
heard from Milton, Delaware.
yeah,
They called the other day, they're trying to get more materials. Anybody has something related to Milton, Delaware?
okay.
So it's Delmar's too.
So briefly too, that wraps up our slideshow, but we do still have an event on Friday. We're going on a field trip to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. You can still sign up today. I think they're gonna close it tonight, so if you wanna go and you haven't signed up yet, then sign up today. We will meet, some of us will meet, if you need to carpool, you can go by yourself, but if you wanna carpool, they're meeting in front of the Target at 7:45, thank you.
By the bank.
By the bank, that's no longer a bank.
Right.
And
It's a railroad.
you know that's got the money in it. So you can meet the carpool there, and then we'll make our way up to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. It is about a 2-hour drive. On here it says it has 2 hours and 15 minutes. The address is on here as well. We will meet up there at 10:30. I am hopeful that we can do a run through of the museum to talk about the things we touched on in the class prior to lunch, and then we'll do lunch, and then after lunch, we'll just break and you can go and look at whatever you like. And so that's basically the plan here. So I have this flyer for anyone who has signed up or wants to sign up.
And then if you register, when you register, the admission to the museum is included in registration.
Oh,
It'll save you a couple bucks.
We don't need to bring a lunch.
There's a restaurant right across the street.
So I'm looking forward to that. I'm gonna try to have some slides printed out, like the slides that have the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania tag on them. That way we can all kind of look at them together. That's if I can get that done. So, very good. That's it. Thank you.